Ethan was a small boy with bright eyes and a quiet personality. He was the kind of child who listened more than he spoke, always observing the world around him with curiosity. People often thought he was shy, but in truth, he simply liked to watch, learn, and imagine. Music had always been something special to him. Even as a toddler, he would stop whatever he was doing whenever he heard a song play in the background. He would listen carefully, almost as if he were trying to understand every sound inside it. One evening, Ethan went with his parents to a community hall for a small weekend event. The hall was full of people. Some were chatting, some were eating, and some were practicing acts they planned to perform later. There was laughter everywhere, the cheerful sound bouncing off the wooden walls. Ethan, however, wasn't paying much attention to the crowd. His eyes were drawn toward something on the stage, a dusty, old piano. It was not new or shiny, but it stood there proudly, waiting for someone to bring it to life. The moment Ethan saw the piano, something inside him changed. His quiet nature gave way to excitement. It was almost like the piano was calling to him, like an old friend he had been waiting to meet. He slowly walked closer, his footsteps light, his eyes wide with admiration. He had played a piano before, but only at home, never in front of other people. At home, music was his secret world, something private and magical. Ethan remembered the nights when he would sneak to the piano after everyone fell asleep. His parents thought he played games or watched cartoons, but instead he would put on headphones and listen to piano pieces online. He didn't know how to read music notes, so he learned by watching videos over and over again, studying how fingers moved, copying every movement until the melody made sense. He spent hours practicing quietly, sometimes messing up, sometimes getting frustrated, but always trying again. This secret routine made Ethan fall in love with music deeply. He didn't play for applause or attention. He played because it made him feel alive. Whenever his fingers touched the keys, his worries disappeared. Even though he was young, music made him feel like he understood something bigger than himself. It was the only place where he felt truly confident, where he didn't need to talk, impress, or be loud. As Ethan stood near the piano in the hall, memories of those quiet nights filled his mind. He wondered what it would feel like to play here in this noisy room where everyone could hear him. The thought made his heart beat faster, not from fear but from possibility. He pictured himself sitting at the bench, pressing the keys, filling the hall with melodies. He didn't want to show off, he simply felt a strong desire to play. While he stared at the piano, a group of older kids walked past him, laughing loudly about something unrelated. Their voices snapped him back to reality. Ethan suddenly remembered that this was not home. This was a place full of strangers, people who didn't know him or his music. He wondered if they would listen or if they would interrupt him, telling him to stop. He wondered if they would laugh at him simply because he was small. The thought made him uncomfortable. But even with these worries, the pull toward the piano didn't fade. His heart felt heavy with longing, like a song wanting to escape but trapped inside his chest. His parents didn't notice anything unusual. They just thought he was wandering around, bored. If they had known what he was thinking, they might have stopped him out of fear that he would embarrass himself. Ethan didn't know how to ask for permission, and he wasn't sure what the rules were. But he kept looking at the piano, feeling its silent presence. He imagined the sound of each note, the rhythm of the melody he practiced night after night. It felt like a secret waiting to be shared, a gift he didn't even know he had. He didn't think about being amazing or surprising anyone. He just wanted to connect with the instrument that meant so much to him. That desire was stronger than his fear, stronger than his shy nature. For the first time, Ethan wished someone would simply ask him, "Do you want to play?" But no one did. They didn't even notice him standing there. To them, he was just a little boy lost in his own thoughts. But inside, he wasn't lost at all. He knew exactly what he wanted. As the lights flickered and the audience got louder, Ethan continued staring at the piano, silently making a decision he didn't fully understand yet. Something inside him whispered that today might be different, that maybe, without planning it, he was going to step into a moment that could change everything. And though he didn't know it, this quiet moment of curiosity and longing was the beginning of a story that would soon surprise everyone in the room, including himself. Ethan stood near the stage, still staring at the piano, when the host of the event announced that anyone who wanted to perform could sign up. The host was an older man with a cheerful voice, but he spoke quickly, as if he didn't expect anything exciting to happen. People clapped politely, not really paying much attention. Most of them were busy talking, eating, or scrolling on their phones. Ethan felt a sudden spark inside him. He didn't fully understand why, but he felt like this was his chance. He quietly walked to where the host was writing names on a sheet of paper. There was a small line of people ahead of him, mostly teenagers who looked confident and loud. They joked with each other, bragging about what they were going to do, sing, dance, rap, tell jokes. Ethan stood behind them silently, holding his hands together to stop them from shaking. No one noticed him. He was so small that he almost disappeared behind the other performers. When one of the older boys turned around and saw him, he raised his eyebrows and smirked. "You performing too?" he asked, sounding amused. Ethan nodded slowly. Before he could answer, the older boy nudged his friend and said, loud enough for Ethan to hear, "This tiny kid is gonna perform." "What's he gonna do?" "Nursery rhymes." They both laughed. Ethan didn't say anything. He wasn't angry, just embarrassed. He wished he could tell them that music wasn't a joke to him, but his voice felt stuck inside his throat. When it was finally his turn to speak to the host, Ethan took a small breath and said softly, "Can I play the piano?" The host looked down at him, as if surprised that someone so small was asking. He blinked for a second, then smiled politely, though it wasn't a very confident smile. "You want to play the piano, little man?" he asked. Ethan nodded again. He wasn't good at explaining himself, so he hoped the man would just say yes. The host sighed lightly as if unsure. The piano hadn't been used in years. It was mostly decoration now. People came to watch singers and comedians, not classical music by a little boy. But there was something in Ethan's eyes, maybe determination, maybe innocence, that made the host hesitate. "Well, all right," he said. "I'll put you on the list." Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but at least he had a chance. The moment he walked away, he heard the murmurs start. The teenagers were whispering again, their voices filled with amusement. "A piano? Seriously? He's gonna bang on the keys like a baby. Why is he even here?" Even some adults turned their heads and smiled in that gentle, pitying way people smile when they expect something silly. To them, Ethan looked too young, too small, too soft to create anything worth listening to. No one imagined that he could play real music. In their minds, a child that size couldn't possibly do anything impressive. Ethan returned to his parents, who hadn't seen him go on stage to sign up. They were busy chatting with another couple, laughing and sharing stories. His mother smiled at him without noticing the nervousness in his eyes. His father offered him a cookie, thinking he looked tired. Ethan didn't tell them anything. He didn't want them to worry or worse, try to stop him. He knew his parents cared about him, but they were protective. They didn't like when he did things that made him uncomfortable, but playing didn't make him uncomfortable. It made him feel brave. Still, as he stood there, he could feel the doubt of the room pressing down on him. He heard more laughter, not cruel laughter, but the kind people make when they expect something funny is about to happen. Ethan was used to being underestimated. In school, teachers often ignored him because he spoke quietly. Kids didn't invite him to games because he wasn't loud enough to fit in. Many people assumed he didn't know things because he didn't talk much. But inside his mind, there was an entire world, full of sounds, melodies, dreams, and thoughts he could never say out loud. As the show began, performers went up one by one. Some sang loudly, some cracked jokes, some danced awkwardly but confidently. The audience clapped politely after each act, enjoying the entertainment without expecting anything extraordinary. Every time someone finished, Ethan's heart beat faster. His name was getting closer to being called. He didn't know what would happen when he stepped onto the stage. He imagined people laughing again when they saw him walk up to the piano. He imagined someone shouting, "Let someone else play." He imagined making mistakes, his fingers slipping, his notes sounding wrong, people covering their ears. But instead of quitting, he quietly repeated a melody inside his head. It calmed him. It reminded him why he wanted to play in the first place, not to prove anyone wrong, not to impress strangers, but because music was the only way he knew how to speak. People might have laughed when he asked to play. They might think he was just a child with no real talent. But Ethan knew something they didn't, something he hadn't shared yet. He knew that once he sat on that piano bench, he wasn't going to be the quiet kid anymore. He was going to become the music he loved. And soon, everyone in that room would have to listen. Ethan watched as the performers continued to go on stage one after another. Some of them were confident, some were nervous, but all of them were older than him. They walked with loud footsteps and talked with big voices like the stage already belonged to them. The audience was cheerful, clapping for every act even when the performances were just okay. People weren't looking for perfection. They were just having fun. But when people noticed Ethan's name on the list, the atmosphere changed slightly. Not everyone reacted, but small groups whispered and chuckled quietly, curious about what this little boy would do. Some didn't even know his name, they just referred to him as that tiny kid. The host eventually glanced at the list again, noticing Ethan's turn was coming. He sighed softly, not because he disliked Ethan, but because he expected something awkward. He imagined a moment where the audience would politely smile and clap for a child who played a few random notes. He imagined having to comfort the boy if he ran off crying. He wished the parent had signed him up instead of letting him go on alone. The teenagers who teased Ethan earlier were sitting close to the stage, waiting for his performance with amused anticipation. One of them even held up his phone ready to record, not because he expected something amazing, but because he thought the video might be funny. "Imagine posting this," he whispered to his friend. "It'll go viral. Little kid destroys piano." They snickered quietly, trying not to get caught. At the back of the room, two older women noticed Ethan sitting alone, staring at the stage. "That boy is going to play?" one asked in disbelief. The other nodded, adjusting her glasses to see him better. "He looks barely 6, she said. "He's probably just going to pound the keys," the first woman replied kindly but with low expectations. Their voices weren't harsh or mean. They simply saw what most adults saw, a shy child too small to do something serious. Even the sound technician, who usually didn't care about the acts, leaned forward and frowned. He wasn't worried about the performance, he was worried about noise. "Great," he muttered, ear-piercing chaos incoming. People weren't cruel, they were just used to experience-shaping ability. In their minds, talent came from age, practice, and confidence, not from a child who barely spoke. As more performers finished, the room grew warm, filled with chatter and noise. Children ran across the aisle. Adults swapped jokes and drinks. Everyone seemed relaxed, enjoying the friendly community event. Ethan, however, felt like he was sitting in a bubble. He heard footsteps, laughter, voices, and claps, but none of it reached him. His mind was somewhere else, imagining the cold piano keys beneath his fingers. He looked at the piano again. Dust covered parts of it and a few keys had chips. It wasn't perfect, but he didn't care. He could play on anything. Music didn't depend on the instrument, it depended on the heart. The host finally walked back to the microphone, clearing his throat to quiet the audience. "Next up," he said with slight hesitation, "we have Ethan. He will be, playing the piano." A short silence followed, not dramatic silence, just a brief pause of curiosity. Then, as expected, small pockets of laughter emerged. Not loud, not cruel, but unmistakably amused. People didn't even try to hide their smiles. They imagined a cute moment, maybe even charming, but definitely not skilled. The teenagers laughed openly. One of them clapped sarcastically. "Let's go, Mozart." He called out jokingly. A few people heard him and laughed, not realizing Ethan could hear too. Ethan felt heat in his cheeks. He looked down, staring at his shoes. For a moment, he thought about saying he changed his mind. He thought about walking away, hiding behind his parents, pretending he never asked to play at all. But something inside him refused to let go. Not pride, not anger, just a quiet but powerful belief that he was meant to sit at that piano today. Still, the doubt in the room was heavy. People weren't waiting to be impressed. They were waiting to see something cute or funny. The audience expected a show, but not music, just a small interruption before the real performers continued. Even the host spoke differently, addressing the crowd with a light, joking tone. "Let's give him lots of support, okay? He's very brave." The word brave sounded like a warning. It meant, "He's not going to be good, but don't laugh too hard." Ethan walked to the stage slowly, trying not to trip. His heart beat fast, but his face remained blank, almost expressionless. He didn't look at the audience because he knew what he would see, eyes filled with doubt and smiles full of pity. As he reached the piano bench, he heard giggles behind him. His hands shook a little as he sat down, the oversized seat swallowing him. His feet didn't touch the ground. He looked tiny, almost comically small compared to the large instrument. Someone whispered loudly, "He can't even reach the pedals." More laughter followed. The host stood nearby, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment happen. He almost stepped forward to help adjust the seat, but then decided not to embarrass the boy further. Ethan stared at the keys. He blocked out the noise, the whispers, the laughter, the cameras, and the doubts. His world shrank into the shape of the piano. Everyone around him believed the same thing. This would be a simple, childish performance. A few wrong notes, a polite applause, and then the show would move on. No one expected silence. No one expected beauty. No one expected brilliance. They doubted him because they saw only a child, not a musician. But Ethan knew something they didn't. All those nights practicing alone. All those melodies he memorized. All those mistakes he learned from. Had not been wasted. They had shaped him quietly, patiently, invisibly. And in just a moment, all the doubt in the room was going to collide with a truth no one was ready for. Ethan sat on the piano bench, feeling the smooth wood beneath him. The seat was too high, so his small legs dangled above the floor. He tried to adjust himself, but no matter how he sat, his feet would not touch the ground. The audience noticed this, and a few soft giggles floated through the air. To them, it looked like a funny picture, this tiny boy sitting on an old piano bench as if he had accidentally wandered onto the stage. Ethan didn't look at anyone. If he did, he knew his courage might break. Instead, he stared at the piano keys, almost as if he was waiting for them to speak to him. The piano had stains and scratches. Several black keys wobbled slightly. It was not a perfect instrument, yet Ethan felt strangely calm in front of it. Imperfect things never scared him. People scared him more than instruments did. The room was still noisy, filled with whispers and rustling. Nobody had settled down yet. The host stood to one side, smiling politely, ready to step in if something went wrong. He had seen countless children attempt things before they were ready. Some cried, some froze, some quit halfway through. He didn't want that to happen to Ethan, but he also didn't believe this boy was going to play anything meaningful. Ethan placed his hands slowly on his lap, afraid to rest them on the keys too early. He remembered all those nights when the piano was the only light in his dark room. He remembered sitting quietly while the world slept, trying to learn music without being taught. He remembered how peaceful it felt when he played correctly and how frustrated he felt when he didn't. But every frustration led to improvement. Every mistake led him deeper into understanding. Music didn't punish him for being small or quiet. As he prepared to play, he took a slow breath. He didn't need to remember the song, his fingers already knew it. His hands were weak, but his memory was strong. The moment he touched the keys, the notes would rise like birds escaping a cage. But before he could press the first key, something distracted him. From the audience, someone whispered loudly, "Why is he so serious? It's just a piano." The comment wasn't meant to hurt him, but it pierced his focus for a moment. He blinked, slightly shaken. For a second, he wondered if he looked foolish, sitting here with such determination. He wondered if people would laugh harder if he failed. He wondered if silence would be better than playing at all. But then another thought came, something strong, gentle, and beautiful. He remembered a line his mother once told him, even if she didn't know how deeply he listened. "If something matters to you, don't let the world make you feel small." His hands moved toward the piano, shaking softly but not giving up. The host tried to get the audience to quiet down. "Let's give him space," he said. "Let's listen." But the room did not fully settle. Some adults continued whispering. Children continued fidgeting. A few teenagers leaned forward, recording with mock excitement. Ethan ignored them. He sat still, back straight, fingers hovering above the keys. In that moment, something changed, not outside, but inside him. He no longer thought about the people around him. He thought only about sound, rhythm, and emotion. He lowered his fingers gently, but before pressing, he paused. The audience thought he had forgotten something. Some thought he was scared, some felt pity. A few smiled kindly, hoping he wouldn't embarrass himself, but Ethan wasn't hesitating. He was listening to silence. Silence mattered. Silence prepared the listeners. Silence told them something was coming. Even though the audience didn't understand it, Ethan did. He finally pressed the first key. But before the sound came, time seemed to slow down. Ethan's heart beat loud in his chest. His breath felt warm, his back tingled. He didn't feel like a boy anymore. He felt like someone filled with something bigger than himself, something he had carried for a long time without showing. The note echoed across the hall, clear and pure. People didn't react immediately, they were still distracted. One note meant nothing to them. Ethan pressed the second key, then a third, then another and another. A soft melody began to shape itself, delicate and steady. His hands moved like tiny dancers, unsure but graceful, carrying more emotion than anyone expected. The audience slowly began to notice. Not because the boy was cute, but because the sound was real. People turned their heads one by one, pulled away from conversations, confused by the quality of what they were hearing. The dusty, tired piano was suddenly alive, singing with unexpected beauty. The teenagers who were recording stopped laughing. Their phones lowered a little, their eyes narrowing in disbelief. Adults leaned forward, silence beginning to replace noise. No one had expected anything like this. No one had imagined that this little boy, sitting on a bench too big for him, would make the piano speak. But Ethan wasn't thinking about them. He wasn't trying to impress or surprise. He simply played because this moment felt right. Because this was his world, his language, his truth. While the audience watched a small boy, Ethan was no longer small. He was music pouring into the air, unbothered by doubt, untouched by laughter. And in that moment, the room began to transform. The first notes that came from the piano were soft, almost too soft for a big room filled with people. But even though the sound was gentle, there was something strangely calm and confident about it. It didn't sound like a child testing the keys. It sounded like someone who already knew exactly what they wanted to say through music. Ethan's fingers moved slowly at first, touching each key with care, as if he was greeting old friends he hadn't seen in a long time. The piano was old and uneven, but he didn't force anything. He let the instrument speak at its own pace, adjusting his hands to its fragile keys. People expected chaos, but what they heard was order. They expected noise, but they got melody. The audience began to notice that this wasn't random. The notes connected to each other, forming a pattern, a story. A few people stopped whispering. A few leaned closer. They didn't clap, they didn't talk, they listened, unsure of what was happening but curious enough to pay attention. Ethan didn't rush. He didn't try to fill the space with loud sound. He played softly, letting each note breathe before moving to the next. He had learned long ago in the quiet nights at home that music wasn't about speed or noise. It was about emotion, space, and timing. It was about making someone feel something without ever saying a word. As more notes followed, the audience went from curious to confused. They looked at each other, eyebrows raised, silently asking the same question. Is this really coming from that little boy? The teenagers stopped smirking. They stared at Ethan with puzzled expressions, their phones still pointed at him but their laughter gone. They didn't know whether to keep recording or stop because suddenly it didn't feel funny anymore. It felt unreal. Even the host, who had been preparing polite words in case the boy failed, found himself frozen. He had heard many children play before, little songs, random sounds, childish rhythms, but this was different, too different. It didn't sound like a beginner, it didn't even sound like a child. It sounded like someone who understood music deeply, someone who practiced for hours, someone who cared. Ethan's hands began moving faster, still with control, still with emotion. The melody grew stronger, richer, more powerful. Notes fell like raindrops, then rose like wind, flowing through the room with a natural rhythm that didn't ask for attention, it demanded it. People stopped drinking, forks stopped clinking, children stopped running. Even the food smelled quieter. The entire hall slowly shifted from noise to silence, pulled in by something they didn't expect, beauty. Ethan wasn't performing for them. He didn't think about how many people were watching or whether they liked it. He didn't think about the room at all. His world was inside the piano, inside the keys, inside the sound. Every movement came from memory, not thought. He didn't count beats like musicians were taught, he felt them. Every rise, every fall, every pause carried meaning that he could never say out loud. Music spoke for him. Music explained who he was when words could not. The audience began reacting without realizing it. Some leaned forward. Some covered their mouths softly. Some widened their eyes. Some blinked several times, trying to understand what they were hearing. They didn't cheer, they didn't shout, they didn't even clap between sections. They just stared because their minds needed time to adjust. A woman whispered to her husband, "He's actually good." But she spoke so softly, as if she was afraid to interrupt the music. The host stepped back slowly, giving Ethan space, realizing that stopping him or interrupting him would be a mistake, maybe even a disrespect. He didn't know where this boy came from or how he learned, but he knew one thing. This moment was not ordinary. Ethan continued, moving into a piece that sounded more emotional than anything before. His fingers slid smoothly, almost like they were floating. His body swayed slightly with the music, not dramatically but naturally, like a leaf moving with breeze. His face stayed calm, but occasionally a tiny expression appeared, a small smile, a small frown, a deep breath, showing that he wasn't just playing notes, he was feeling them. People felt something unusual, a connection. The music didn't shout, "Look at me," it whispered, "Feel this with me." And without knowing how or why, listeners began feeling it. Their hearts grew softer, their breathing slowed. The laughter that once filled the hall had no place here anymore. The teenager who was recording lowered his phone slowly. He didn't stop recording, but the phone fell to his chest because he forgot that he was holding it. His friend whispered, but this time not with sarcasm, "What is happening right now?" No one could explain it because it didn't make sense. Talent wasn't supposed to belong to someone so small, so quiet, so invisible. And yet here it was, unapologetic, undeniable, unstoppable. Ethan's hands reached a softer part of the music, almost like a lullaby. The room was so still that even the faintest note echoed. If someone dropped a coin, everyone would have heard it. It wasn't just silence, it was respect. It was awe. And though Ethan never thought of himself as impressive, the world around him was slowly waking up to a truth they had missed at first glance. This was not a cute moment. This was not a joke. This was not beginner luck. This was real skill, quiet, hidden, and breathtaking, unfolding note by note in front of people who never expected it and now couldn't look away. Ethan continued to play, but now his hands moved with a confidence and speed that the audience had not seen before. The melody transformed into something fuller, richer, as if the music had suddenly taken wings and flown across the room. What began as a soft, gentle tune grew into something powerful, emotional, and unexpectedly mature. He wasn't just playing random lovely sounds anymore. He was performing a complex classical piece that most children his age wouldn't even know existed, much less know how to play. But Ethan knew it. He didn't need sheet music. He didn't need someone telling him what to do. His fingers seemed to remember everything on their own, moving with precision and purpose, like they had a mind separate from his body. Some audience members leaned back in their seats, stunned. Others leaned forward, trying to understand what they were witnessing. They knew enough to realize that this wasn't simple. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a cute attempt. This was real talent. Talent that didn't match his age or size. Ethan's fingers began moving faster, crossing over each other, switching positions smoothly, hitting every key with accuracy. His left hand kept a steady rhythm, while his right hand danced above it, creating melodies that curled through the air like smoke. The old piano sounded beautiful, as if it was grateful to finally be played with love after so many years of silence. People started whispering again, but now the whispers were different. There was no laughter, no doubt, no sarcasm. Just disbelief. How does he know this? How old is he? He's playing like an adult. This can't be real. He's playing like an adult. This can't be real. Even the teenagers who had mocked him before were silent. Their phones were still recording, but they weren't snickering. Their expressions were serious now, almost worried, as if this performance challenged everything they thought they understood about ability. The host, who had been ready to comfort a failed performance, now felt his heart beating faster. He had seen musicians before, good ones, trained ones, experienced ones, but there was something different about Ethan. This wasn't just talent, this was passion, and passion is something that can't be taught in lessons or handed down in books. It has to be discovered, shaped, lived. Ethan wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't thinking about the audience staring at him with wide eyes. He wasn't thinking about the laughter from earlier or the expectations that weighed against him. He wasn't thinking at all. He was simply lost in the music, letting it carry him forward. At home, he had spent countless nights watching video tutorials of classical performances. He would rewind sections over and over, memorizing finger placements, repeating them until they felt natural. He didn't understand the technical terms, but his heart understood the emotion. That was enough. He practiced in secret because he didn't want people to make fun of him for loving something boring or old-fashioned. Kids his age liked video games and cartoons, not classical music, but Ethan didn't care. Music made him feel calm. It made him feel bigger than the world around him. It gave him control over feelings he didn't know how to express. And now, every hour of practice, every mistake, every moment of frustration was shaping this performance. He had failed thousands of times at home, alone in the dark. But failure taught him things that success never could. As he played, the room began to feel different. Not physically different, but emotionally different. It felt heavier, as if everyone was holding their breath without realizing it. Adults who had been talking loudly now sat perfectly still, their hands folded, their eyes locked on the stage. Children who had been running around earlier stood near their parents, mesmerized. Even the sound technician forgot to adjust anything. This wasn't just music. This was a story told without words. The melody shifted again, becoming softer, sadder, as if remembering a painful memory. Ethan slowed down, his fingers pressing gently, giving each note room to echo. Some people felt their hearts ache without knowing why. Music does that. It reaches places inside the human soul that words can't touch. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. Not because she wanted to cry, but because she didn't know how else to respond to such unexpected beauty. A man next to her wiped his eyes, pretending he had something in them. The teenage boy slowly lowered his phone altogether. He didn't want to record anymore. He wanted to experience it. He wanted to remember it. Ethan's body moved with the music, but not dramatically, not in a showy way. His motions were small, controlled, natural, as if his entire body was breathing with the piano. For someone so young, his sense of timing and emotion was astonishing. He didn't pause at the wrong moments. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He understood flow, balance, and feeling. But the most incredible thing was this. Ethan didn't know he was doing something extraordinary. To him, this was normal. This was how music felt every time he played. The audience, however, understood exactly how rare this moment was. They could feel how unusual, how special, how fragile it was. Some even worried that if they moved, if they coughed, if they whispered, they might break it, like disturbing a butterfly that had landed quietly on their hand. The soft part of the music slowly faded, giving way to a powerful finale full of confidence and fire. Ethan's fingers burst into speed again, his hands flying across the keys like sparks. The room shook with emotion, not noise but intensity. People who had doubted him were now witnessing something unforgettable. Something they would talk about later, not because it was funny, but because it was beautiful. Because it reminded them that talent can appear anywhere at any age without warning. And Ethan, unaware of the shock he had created, kept playing with the same focus he always had at home, with love, with passion, with honesty. He didn't know it yet, but this moment was changing everyone in that room. It was changing how they saw him. It was changing how they saw children. It was changing how they saw talent itself. And it wasn't over yet. When Ethan reached the final section of the piece, the music changed. It slowed down again, becoming softer and more emotional, almost like a goodbye. His fingers pressed the keys with gentle care, stretching out the final notes as if he didn't want the song to end too quickly. He wasn't thinking about impressing anyone. He just wanted to finish the story he had started. The audience felt the shift immediately. They didn't need to know music to understand that something special was happening. The melody sounded fragile, like something that could break if touched too roughly. People leaned forward, not because they wanted to see better, but because they didn't want to miss a single sound. Ethan's face was calm, but there was a kind of seriousness in his eyes. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't frowning, he was simply present, fully inside the music. His small body looked almost still, except for his hands, which moved with soft precision. He was a child, but he played with the emotion of someone much older, someone who had lived through things he didn't even understand yet. As he neared the last notes, the audience realized something powerful. They were holding their breath. The room had become so quiet it felt unreal, like time had paused. Nobody coughed, nobody whispered, nobody moved. Even the children who usually couldn't sit still were silent, staring at the stage with wide eyes. And then with the lightest touch, Ethan played the final notes, slow, delicate, perfect. The sound faded into the air like a whisper disappearing into the night. There was no sudden ending, no dramatic crash. Just a peaceful, gentle finish that wrapped the performance like a soft blanket. For a moment nothing happened, no clapping, no cheering, no laughter, nothing. It was not the silence of boredom, it was the silence of shock. People were frozen, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how to react. Their brains were trying to catch up with what they just experienced. They needed a moment to understand that what they heard was real, not imagined, not exaggerated. The teenagers who had made fun of Ethan earlier sat completely still. Their mouths were open slightly, but no words came out. One of them blinked rapidly, as if waking from a dream. The other simply stared, eyes wide with disbelief, unable to hide the respect slowly forming inside him. The two older women who had assumed Ethan would bang on the keys stared at each other with stunned expressions. One of them had tears forming in her eyes, though she didn't know why. She wasn't sad. She was moved, something she hadn't expected at a community talent show. The host stood frozen too, his hand halfway raised, unable to decide whether to step forward or stay still. He had prepared encouraging words, polite words, maybe even comforting words, but he didn't need them anymore. Everything he had assumed about this performance had been destroyed. The sound technician, who had expected a loud mess of random notes, looked at the piano like it was a piece of magic equipment. He had never seen anyone, especially a child, play so beautifully on an instrument so old and imperfect. But most powerful of all were the people who had laughed. The ones who had smirked, whispered, or joked about Ethan before he even touched the keys. Those people now sat in silent embarrassment, feeling small, guilty, and humbled. They avoided looking at each other because they didn't want to admit how wrong they had been. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone felt it. They had underestimated him. They had judged him. They had doubted him without giving him a chance. And now they were facing the truth. Ethan slowly lifted his hands from the keys, letting them rest in his lap. He looked up for the first time, unsure if he had done well or made a mistake. His heart beat fast, not because he was nervous, but because he was suddenly aware of the silence. He expected noise. He expected clapping or laughter or someone telling him to stop. Instead, the silence felt heavy, full of emotion, full of meaning. He didn't know if it was good or bad. He didn't know if people were impressed or simply confused. His eyes moved around the room, searching for some kind of reaction. He saw faces staring at him, but with expressions he couldn't read. Some looked shocked, some looked emotional, some looked guilty, some looked amazed. For a second he felt exposed, not embarrassed but vulnerable. He had shared a piece of himself with people who didn't know him. He didn't play perfectly, but he played honestly. And honesty can feel scary even for someone brave. Then something small but unmistakable happened. A single clap. One person sitting near the front slowly brought their hands together. The sound echoed softly through the silent hall. It wasn't loud, but it was certain. It was not pity, it was respect. Others joined cautiously at first, still trying to understand what they felt. The rhythm grew, not fast, not wild, but steady. People clapped not because they were expected to, but because they couldn't help it. They weren't clapping for a cute moment. They weren't clapping for a funny performance. They were clapping because they had been moved, genuinely, deeply moved. Ethan didn't smile widely or jump with excitement. He simply lowered his eyes shyly, almost embarrassed by the attention. But inside, he felt something warm, something new. He had been heard. He had been seen. He had been understood, not by words, not by explanations, but by music. And even though he didn't know it, the silence before the applause was the highest kind of praise he could have ever received. The applause that began softly soon grew louder, stronger, and more emotional than anyone expected. People clapped with real feeling, not polite feeling. They weren't rushing or cheering wildly. They were giving the kind of respect normally saved for artists who had mastered their craft. It was a slow rise instead of an explosion, but that made it even more meaningful. It meant they weren't reacting out of habit. They were reacting out of awe. Ethan looked around, unsure what to do with all the attention. His cheeks turned red and he lowered his head slightly, almost hiding behind his hair. He wasn't used to this kind of reaction. At home, the only applause he ever got was from his own heart when he played correctly. He had never performed in front of so many people, and he certainly had never expected them to applaud like this. The teenagers who had laughed earlier now clapped the hardest. They didn't do it because they wanted to make up for their behavior. They didn't even know how to make up for it. They did it because they genuinely believed Ethan deserved it. Their laughter earlier now felt childish and embarrassing. They realized that talent doesn't always come in loud, confident forms. Sometimes it comes quietly, wrapped in shyness, waiting to be discovered. One of them, the boy who had been filming, looked at his phone screen again. His video wasn't funny. It wasn't embarrassing. It wasn't meme material. It was something beautiful, a small boy playing with skill far beyond his age. He didn't know whether to post it or keep it private, as if sharing it with the world would ruin the magic that happened in that room. Parents nudged each other, asking the same question in whispers. Who is this boy? Where did he learn? How old is he? Nobody knew. Ethan's parents, who had been chatting in the back during most of the performance, now stared in shock. They couldn't be sure at first that the boy on stage was their son. It seemed impossible. They had heard him play at home, of course, but they had never heard him play like this. They didn't know that he had been secretly practicing more complicated music late at night. They didn't know how deep his passion ran. His mother covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide, as if she was seeing her son for the first time. His father felt a strange mix of pride and guilt. Pride because his son had done something incredible. Guilt because he had never realized just how much music mattered to him. He wondered if he should have paid more attention, asked more questions, listened more closely. The host stepped forward slowly, almost afraid to disturb the moment. His voice, usually loud and cheerful, now sounded softer, more careful. That was truly amazing, he said, looking at Ethan with genuine respect. Thank you for sharing that with us. He didn't speak like someone congratulating a child. He spoke like someone speaking to a musician. The difference was small, but Ethan felt it. For the first time, Ethan lifted his eyes toward the audience fully. He didn't see laughter or doubt anymore. He saw admiration, warmth, and something even more valuable, belief. People weren't looking at him like a child doing something cute. They were looking at him like a young person who had something important to offer. Someone in the audience stood up, starting a standing ovation. Others followed, slowly at first, then more confidently as they realized they weren't alone. Soon, most of the room was standing, clapping with respect that felt almost heavy. Not everyone stood, some were too shocked to move, but it didn't matter. The emotion in the room was enough. Ethan didn't smile widely, but a small, shy smile curled at the corners of his mouth. He wasn't used to big expressions. Happiness for him was quiet. It lived inward in his chest, in his heart. He stood up from the bench slowly, his legs barely steady. He gave a small bow, not because anyone taught him how to, but because it felt right. It felt like a thank you, not for the applause, but for listening, for giving him a chance. He stepped away from the piano, but not quickly. He walked slowly, almost reluctantly, as if part of him wanted to stay connected to the instrument a little longer. The piano had given him a voice tonight. Leaving it felt like leaving a friend behind. People tried to speak to him as he walked past, compliments, questions, excitement, but Ethan didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to so many words aimed at him. He wasn't used to anyone expecting a response. So he just nodded shyly, his eyes down, his hands hidden in his sleeves. His parents rushed toward him, their expressions full of emotions they couldn't express quickly enough. His mother hugged him tightly, surprising him. His father placed a gentle hand on his head, not knowing what to say. They didn't scold him for going on stage without asking permission. They didn't worry about what people thought. They didn't care anymore. They had just witnessed something rare, something that didn't need explanation. People around them continued talking, sharing reactions, still stunned by what they had seen. They didn't talk about jokes or mistakes or awkward moments. They talked about music. They talked about emotion. They talked about talent. For years to come, many of them would remember that evening, not because it was a talent show, but because of a moment that took everyone by surprise. A moment when a quiet child stepped forward, faced laughter, faced doubt, faced uncertainty, and changed a room full of strangers without saying a single word. Ethan didn't plan to change anyone. He didn't plan to shock anyone. All he ever wanted was simple: to play, to express, to feel free. And by doing that without trying, he became unforgettable. Not because he was loud. Not because he demanded attention. But because he proved something powerful. Sometimes the smallest voice in the room has the biggest story to tell.